Hi, I'm Corey DAugustine. Welcome back to In the Studio. Today we are responding to some of the comments from previous sections, specifically some interest in Pablo Picasso, undoubtedly one of the most crucial artists of the 20th century. Well, we're not going to take on our friend Pablo directly. Instead, we're going to explore one of the movements that he is most closely associated with, and of course that's Cubism, really one of the watershed moments in the 20th century is 1907's Demoiselle d'Avignon. We'll take a look at that work in a moment, launching Cubism, which gave way directly to abstraction. You may notice that we're in a slightly different location today. The studio at MoMA is being renovated, so we're actually at my house today. Welcome. But at any rate, today I'd like to explain why Cubism happened. So not only demonstrate how to make a Cubist type painting, but really understand how to look at a Cubist painting, how to understand a Cubist handling of space and the logic here, since I think a lot of us can agree that Cubism is one of the more difficult movements to understand. Part of my job here today is to unravel this really interesting and complicated thread. So, Pablo Picasso, at the age of 14, paints a painting that would be very comfortable on the walls of Museo Prado. That's the Prado Museum in Madrid, where he essentially went to school looking at great paintings by Velázquez, by El Greco, by Zurbarán, artists like that. But before we Picasso, as almost everyone does, I want to give a really well-deserved mention to Georges Braque, because Braque, the French painter, was really equally responsible for the innovations and the inventions of Cubism, as we'll see shortly. 1907, Demoiselle d'Avignon, a great historical moment in the beginning of the 20th century, where Picasso launches Cubism. And as we look at this painting, which is in MoMA's collection, notice that, well, certainly realism is far from what Picasso is dealing with here. Instead, he's compressed that space, all these flat shards. It almost looks like the picture plane is a sheet of glass that's been shattered. If you imagine how far you could walk into the space of this painting, well, it's not very far. Contrast that with an old master painting, think about Mona Lisa, for example, and suddenly imagine how far you could walk behind Mona Lisa until you get to those mountains. Months, perhaps. Okay, this is the space of painting that I'm talking about here, and the Picasso and Braque really shattered. But if we look down at the bottom end of this painting, we realize why Picasso is painting in this style. This still life down here, which maybe you didn't even notice at first, is in fact painted from a different perspective. What I mean by that is that when we look at these lovely ladies, the demoiselles themselves, it's a frontal perspective. We are looking at them, they're looking back at us. And in fact, that's just like every other painting you've seen in an old master gallery. The painter has one perspective. Well, Picasso here, almost as a riddle, is asking, well, what would a painting look like if it had two perspectives? And the answer is it looks weird, because none of us have an experience like this. I am seeing one thing right now, and as you're looking at the computer screen, you're seeing one thing, your perspective. Well, to juxtapose two different perspectives in this very closed aesthetic space is difficult, it's a head scratcher, it's a riddle. Now, as we move forward by a couple of years, Girl with Mandolin, also in the Moderns collection, we can see that there are far more than two perspectives. Each one of these shards, if you will, count them, I don't know, I never did, there's 40 or 50, something like that. Each one of these shards is painted from a different perspective. And what I mean by that is that some of these shards, if we move from left to right, go from a highlight to shadow, meaning that that light source is on the left-hand side of, well, the canvas. Other of those shards, however, go from shadow to light, meaning that the light is on the other side. Now, this doesn't make sense. This is not how we experience the world around us. And we realize that Picasso is pushing away from realism, and he's becoming quite cerebral. So, Girl with Mandolin, early analytical Cubist painting. Why analytical? It's kind of chapter 1 of Cubism. He's analyzing the space of this girl and this musical instrument. So I've set up a still life here. Before we take a look at the still life, I want to show you the New York School artist Ad Reinhardt's comic explaining essentially what I just explained to you. If we take a look at this wonderful comic by Reinhardt, we find ourselves at the Prado or at the Met here in New York City. And here's the space of that painting. It's from one perspective, and we see the illusion of depth, this great invention of the European Renaissance. If you look at a Cubist painting, however, it's flat, and you can't find any space behind there whatsoever. The reason why is that we're not only looking at this glass, this goblet, from one perspective, but we have a side view and a top view. In other words, an aerial view, looking straight down, juxtaposed together here. And that aerial view is important because photography, of course, exists at this point in time, and perhaps realism is not so interesting anymore. since you're competing with photography. Perhaps a painter's job then becomes more difficult, more interesting, or perhaps more cerebral. I think Picasso would agree with that. This canvas, last week I stretched and primed. This is a linen canvas. You can see just because of its color here, a little brown, not the cotton duck that we worked with in some of the previous demos. And I've put a calcium or a chalk-based oil ground here. Why? Well, Picasso typically worked this way, Braque typically worked this way, not always, by the way. But you'll notice that it's a little bit more translucent. It's not a super hard, opaque white like a lot of the more contemporary primers or gessos are. Also, this is an oil-based ground, not an acrylic. Acrylic, of course, didn't exist in the Cubist era. So what I'm going to do here is just simply begin by thinking about this still life through the lens of geometry. And a very important artist, in fact, a very important artist to Picasso and Braque is Paul Cézanne. Cézanne in 1904 talked about thinking about nature in terms of cones, in terms of spheres. In other words, reducing all that complexity of our natural experience of the world through the lens of geometry. In fact, I'm going to do exactly the same thing now. In other words, I'm going to be finding linear aspects of some wonderfully delicate and non-linear shapes here. Okay, so I've just made a couple marks here. What I'm doing is capturing the curve of the stool, some of the lines of this drapery, this tablecloth, what have you. Now I'm going to do something weird. Rather than continue this drawing, I'm going to move a little bit. I'm going to continue the drawing here, but now from a different perspective. Of course, everything has moved here, but I'm going to continue seamlessly connecting the lines that I've already made. So for example, when I'm standing looking at this wine bottle from this perspective, I see a straight line, that's the label, in the center of the bottle. Of course, when I was over here, that straight line coincided with the edge. So on the one hand, I've drawn the right edge with that curve, but since I've captured the center now here, I've sliced straight through the center of the bottle. Now this is all going to start to make more sense once we start filling in these empty spaces around them. Looking down on objects, looking up at objects, capturing as many different perspectives as the still life allows. Okay, so about halfway through the underdrawing here, a couple things that you can notice here. This semicircle, I started capturing an aerial view looking down into that wine glass for half of it. Right next to it, I was on the back side here, capturing a straight-on frontal perspective, and there is that contour of the side. Now they don't connect, and that's fine. It's interesting that as you move around, of course, what you're looking at moves around. Sometimes certain perspectives, something's in the front, and then from the reverse perspective, excuse me, of course, it's in the back. A couple of these leaves I've summarized as triangles. The wine bottle a couple times, different contours, different edges, etc. Now I may add a couple more lines later, but this is coming from all of these different areas of that tablecloth that we're seeing in all these interesting folds, which of course are rather soft, and I've summarized them through very linear kind of geometry. So the next thing I'm going to do is some shading. Now, of course, very little of this drawing and very little of the shading is going to be evident in the finished painting, but this is going to help me know what goes where, in other words, and I can still edit freely at this phase of the game. I'm going to reinforce some of the shadows I see coming on the underside of there, some of the shadows coming off of some of these leaves. Okay, so a interesting looking preparatory sketch or an underdrawing. Haven't even picked up the paintbrush yet, but you can start to see how some of these forms are developing, and you're getting the sense that rather than this three-dimensional illusionistic space that I could have created, instead of compressed everything, I've taken that space and packed it into this very, very shallow or very narrow pictorial space, very close to the picture plane. Now, it's not exactly the same plane because these shading, this modeling here tells you that things are a little bit tilted. They're a little bit rounded, like the edge of this, of the inside of the wine glass, etc. But of course, it doesn't resolve, because for your eye to really understand this rational, inhabitable, three-dimensional space, everything needs to have the same type of shading. Instead here, everything is going every different direction. It's extraordinarily complex. All right, so taking a look at the palette that I'm preparing here, you might rightly say, well, this is not the most beautiful palette in the world. If you looked at some of the work we did in the style of de Kooning in previous weeks, we have this celebration, this explosion of color at times, and here, well, there's a black and a brown and a lighter brown and an ochre and a kind of earthy yellow color and kind of a dull green, and okay, a couple hints of some more vibrant colors over here. But in fact, many of the early Cubist painters deliberately worked with, let's call them boring or toned down palettes. Why? Not because they didn't want to make beautiful paintings, certainly not, but because they realized that color has a space of its own. And what I mean by that, and Cezanne knew this very well, by the way, is that hot colors like this red, they're very aggressive and they push forward. Not the shading of the painting, but just the color itself has a kind of space. Cool colors like these blues and these grays, or some of the grays that I'm about to mix, or this green here, they're calmer. They kind of are quieter in our eye. They retreat away from the picture plane. They press back into the space. In other words, they also have a kind of space. So I'm tackling Braque and Picasso circa 1910, 1911. There's not a whole lot of color, but as you can see, there's a whole lot of spatial complexity. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is to grab a rather large brush. I'm going to get a little bit of that murky turpentine into my palette, and probably a good time to mention that there is not one way to make a Cubist painting. So I'm just summarizing here, interpreting some of these different techniques. So a little bit of murky turpentine here, and to that, I'm going to take a little bit of Naples yellow and a little bit of ochre, a little bit more of ochre, still a little bit more of ochre. Now, because I'm working with turpentine and not with linseed oil, the binder, the vehicle of this paint, it's going to stay matte and it's going to stain into the canvas a little bit. It's not going to be so glossy and translucent. It's going to be more matte and opaque. Now, I'm just going to use this to warm up a couple areas out towards the edges of the canvas a little bit. You can see that this is going on quite thinly, and that's great. You can also see that it does pick up the charcoal a little bit. One reason that I'm starting off with this light color, you're going to see that this painting will become quite dark. But it's much easier in oil painting, wet in wet, what I'm going to be demonstrating today, to go from light to dark than it is from dark to light. In other words, if I put a dark color in here, I'm going to make it really dark very quickly. If I have a black paint, which I will, and then I add some white to it or some yellow, it's going to stay quite muddy, quite dark. So especially for beginning painters of this technique, working light to dark is really going to save you some heartache. Okay, so what we can see here is that the painting is still extremely flat, and this is really the name of the game here. The shading is still doing its function, but now there are some warmer areas which are pushing forward in space a little bit. Well, what I'm going to do now, to start going back to the still life, looking at the colors that I'm seeing here, and then interpreting where these different shades are going to go. And I'm going to start by, let's say, looking at the wine glass, which to me looks pretty gray. I'm seeing some whites in there. I'm seeing some dark grays, but a whole lot of that is a kind of medium or even light gray. So let's mix up some of that. You can see I'm keeping my brush strokes very short, staccato, and parallel. This is a technique that Braque and Picasso used to further reinforce the flatness, the two-dimensionality of the picture plane. He wants to draw your attention to the fact that these are individual marks placed right on the canvas, flat. We're announcing this is an object. It's a flat canvas with little lumps of paint on it. Well, if this doesn't sound very complicated, in a sense it's not, but it's gloriously unsophisticated from Picasso here, who really had the most sophisticated hand. Well, what I'm going to do around that is just reinforce those lines now, which of course are just charcoal, they're just drawn lines. I'm going to reinforce them with some black paint, I should say. And a nice trick for if you really want to make straight lines with paint is to use a metal edge. So now I'm executing some of these curves here. I've just switched to a smaller brush. Let's call this the armature or the skeleton of the painting here. We've reinforced those black lines and in fact the grid, right? Up, down, left, right. The grid is very explicit here since that is the principal geometric device that I'm using to flatten all of this spatial complexity. Okay, so you can see what I've been doing here is to start reinforcing some of the shading that was originally done with charcoal, darkening them with some blacks and then some dark grays, and some of this modeling here going from dark to light. One thing I'm noticing as I'm beginning to get some of these tensions between the shadows and the hot spots here, you'll notice also that sometimes I'm using highlights in white. Other times I'm letting this kind of Naples yellow bright color peek through, relatively bright color anyway. One thing I'm going to do here is to start reinforcing some of these lines. Some of those black lines I've lost. And if you look carefully at Braque and Picasso paintings by Juan Gris and others, you'll notice that those lines are repeated again and again and again. And this is why I'm painting wet in wet. For example, this line here, which was a rather delicate curved line, is now all fuzzy. Why? Because I've been using that chattering kind of staccato brushwork in there. So I'm going to start reinforcing some of those lines, darkening them, making them a little bit more crisp. I think I'm also going to add a couple more verticals in here. So I'm going to do that, add a couple more black lines now. I'm going to start building a couple more of these mid-tones, these middle grays, which are nice and flexible because I can either lighten or deepen them as this painting develops. One thing you'll notice as I'm painting here, I'm keeping the directionality of the brushwork quite parallel. And again, this reinforces the planarity of the painting itself, the flatness in other words. You'll also notice that as I'm starting to do some of this rudimentary shading, I say rudimentary, this is deliberately rudimentary on the part of these cubists here, again, calling your attention to the bluntness, the physical presence of the two-dimensional support here. I'm going sometimes from dark to light, and other times from light to dark. This is wet in wet or alla prima painting, the same kind of technique actually that we explored in de Kooning, wet, wet, wet paint, but now it's very quiet, these small little staccato brushworks rather than these open-end cursive ones that we looked at in de Kooning's work. I'm going to start adding a little bit more color. Don't get too excited, just a little bit more color. This is a early Cubist type painting after all. But I'm going to start deepening some of these yellows. I'm also going to start adding a touch of green in the plant, a touch of red in the apple, some of the kind of peachy color of the label of the wine bottle, as well as that nice burgundy up there at the top of the cap. All right, so slowly some color coming into the equation here, maybe too much. We'll see about that. Some of these reds are looking aggressive, especially that spot right there. I've added a couple hints of the red into the black here as I'm noticing some of the tips of the individual leaf there, go to purple or a dark red, a little bit of yellow in there also. Now clearly this is not realism, and there's not so much observation of color that I'm doing here. I'm more concerned with form and space and how these things relate to each other. What I'm going to do next, again, is to start reinforcing some of those blacks, some of those lines that have gotten a little bit lost in some of this wet and wet painting, intermittently reinforcing that armature, that grid, that framework of the composition before returning to the more elegant brushwork between those lines. You can start to see that this composition is tightening up. The brushwork is a little bit loose and jagged in places. Here, this is really, to my eye, very hard to understand what we're looking at here. This is, in fact, one shape of that wine glass and then another reflection that's in it. But I fudged that line a little bit here, and I changed my mind about the colors, and the reflections are a little bit confusing here. So that's going to need some editing. But what I'm basically trying to do here is knock out all of these areas of the unpainted canvas, of that ground that are peeking through. Now around the edges, not such a concern. In fact, you'll notice that most of my black lines of the grid, I stop short of the edges. Now some do go through, but a lot stop short. This is a really characteristic device of early Cubism, where they kind of fade out or get a little bit fuzzy towards the edges. Otherwise, this becomes very, very rectilinear. In fact, an artist who took this idea and ran with it is Pete Mondrian, someone who maybe we'll look at in another video sometime, who took that implicit grid here and made it explicit, and basically made an entire career out of that. So what I'm going to do is go back to that middle dark gray and start to knock out some of these areas that are a little bit ambiguous at the moment. All right, so nice stopping point here. Some things I like, some things I don't. What do I like? I like how we're starting to build some interesting contrast between the density of forms here and some of the looseness in the space around the still life. But this, the Naples yellow that I find kind of all over the canvas, remember that was actually the very first thing that I put down over the drawing, it's a little bit too everywhere, meaning that this composition is kind of all over, and I have a hard time differentiating the still life from the space around it. Now, as a matter of fact, this is exactly the direction that Picasso and Braque pushed in a little bit later. Here, I wanted to have a little bit more difference between the space of the still life and the space around it. And as I'm looking more at it, there's a couple things I'm noticing. The tablecloth, if you will, first of all, I haven't added any of the blue color in. I'll do that. But it's also quite light. And these light areas are where I knocked out the canvas with this Naples yellow. It's the wrong color. It's not really light enough down here. So I'm going to start adding a lot more light grays and some grayish light blues here. Meanwhile, as I'm looking behind the still life, there's a lot of empty dark space back there. So I'm going to start pushing this a little bit further back. In other words, making a little bit more dark gray, a little bit more black up in this upper register of the painting. All right, so let's do it. Actually, this is probably a good time to shift into my clean turpentine, since I'm going to start working with some lighter colors. Okay, so I've effectively knocked out a lot of that Naples yellow down at the lower margin of the painting here. Now I like that color when it's peeking through, but I think we agreed it was a little too strong before. I've knocked out a lot of that. I've lightened up this foreground. I'm now going to do the opposite to the upper register of the painting. I'm going to deepen this space, this kind of empty dark space around this still life here. And again, I'm going to knock out these Naples yellows, but I'm going to push them back a little bit rather than pulling them forward. All right, so the space is starting to push back a little bit at the top and come forward a little bit at the bottom like I was hoping for. However, predictably, I've lost the grid again. So I'm going to go back and reinforce those lines once more. All right, things are starting to come together nicely here. A couple things are sticking in my eye. Again, I have a little bit too much of that Naples yellow peeking through, although one of them is the label of the wine bottle, which is rather close to that color. I'll lighten it up a little bit. Also, the textures in here are not as refined as what's going on around the edges. I haven't spent as much time on them, in other words. So if you come in and look here, you see there's this nice feathery touch, right? So all these little chattery brushstrokes are quite small and vibrating up against each other. Contrast that with some rather flatly painted areas, like this black is a little chunky in here. This red is a little bit chunky as well. So I'm going to switch to a smaller brush and get some of that chattering quality back that you see in some areas, but not other ones. By the way, this is how a lot of paintings work, right? When you strengthen one area of the painting, other areas that didn't seem like they were a problem before suddenly look weak in comparison and need to be corrected. All right, things coming along rather nicely here, I think. One thing you might notice here, it's a subtle one, but it's an interesting game that Braque and Picasso and other Cubist artists used. These lines this last time, they're not black. They're black with a lot of umber mixed in, so they have a little bit of a kind of a dark burgundy, yeah, I got wine on the mind, I guess, color here, which gives it a nice, rhyme, if you will, with some of the black. Just a little bit more optical incident, a little bit more food for the eye, so to speak. What I'm going to do now is take care of the edges a little bit. You might say, well, what's wrong with the edges? There's some nicely painted areas of the edges. I think so, but I think what I'd like to have happen is really to start focusing more on the still life and less on the space around it, both the foreground and the background. So the way I'm going to go about doing that is literally to remove some paint from around the edges. Now to do that, I'm just going to use the rag that I've been working with here. I'm going to get it a little bit damp with turpentine, doesn't need much. And then I'm going to start scrubbing a little bit around the edges. Okay, so a subtle effect, but I've started to blur and blend and weaken and fade, etc. around the edges, which I think does focus our eye's attention back on the center of the work a little bit. I'm going to shift gears back to the center of the work now. I'm going to add a little bit more light, a little bit more space, a little bit more white back into the work, and then I'm going to add a couple blue bits. Okay, let's see what a little blue does. So kind of a playful idea, summarizing the kind of polka dot pattern there. Braque and Picasso, for all the seriousness and the gravity of Cubism, all the braininess and the cerebral qualities, they always had a sense of humor, sticking in these little visual jokes like this, polka dots that are totally flat where they don't belong. Of course, if I'm trying to paint this perspectively, it's going to be rolling every way, and those dots are not even dots to begin with. They're all kind of organic shapes anyway. But I've just kind of superimposed them very childlike, very playfully over just a couple zones. Maybe I'll add a couple more, but let me hold that thought for now. I'm now going to reinforce the black lines around those again. So getting pretty close to stopping point here. Now again, this is an oil painting. It's nice always to work wet over dry. You know, this kind of paint is going to take 3-4 days to dry. So always nice to have that extra recourse to additional painting that oil paint affords. But some of the things that you can see that I've done here are to really accentuate the center of the painting here. Not only with these design motifs, these polka dots, etc. The strongest colors we have in the painting are towards the center, but to make it related to everything else, I've brought some of that blue out and brought it just a hint of it here and a hint of it here, a hint of it down here. This red, which you see coming from the apple, and also the orangey, planter, is also mirrored up here in the cover for the cork of the wine, a little bit of the reflectance here in the glass. So it's nice to bring these elements elsewhere in the painting to really make the center, make the subject related to everything else in the painting. So we have this kind of balance. We're not really center heavy here. The center of gravity is not really anchored in the center because it is distributed elsewhere. Then again, the center does have a little bit more density of the lines, you know, the shapes, the shards, if you will, are much smaller, much tighter. So there is something pulling your eye down here, which guess what, is right in the center of the still life. I'm just putting a couple touches on here, you know, just to give a little bit more interest to some passages that maybe aren't as interesting as others here. And as you've definitely seen by now in this video, this kind of painting, this kind of analytical cubism is all about fussing, right? So it's about looking and adjusting, etc., composing, but then about fussing with every little brushstroke, every little texture, etc. So as you saw in the beginning of this painting, I was doing a whole lot of looking at the still life itself. As the painting grows, as it lives, you start looking a lot more at the painting itself. What does it need? Not what does the still life need. It's already really fulfilled its role. In fact, turning our back on the still life, as you've seen me do a couple times in the video, is something that Braque and Picasso did increasingly in 1910, 1911, as they're moving forward towards that next huge essential jump from analytical cubism, as I've been working in the style of today, to synthetic cubism, where no longer is it still life even necessary to look at to actually compose one, or better said, to create one. Interesting to note that for all the radical painting that Braque and Picasso did, all the experiments, all the innovations of cubism, between the two of them, they never made a single abstract painting. They came this close, but they let a horde of other painters, their followers, many of them, take that plunge into abstraction. We'll talk about that another time. So click on subscribe, make sure you don't miss any of the future videos like this in the studio, or How to See, another great series we have here at the Museum of Modern Art. Actually, we're at my house, but you know, bear with me. Also check out our course on Coursera. That's free and has a whole lot of information like this. So thanks again for watching. See you next time.